G'day. I recently made this chair, which some might call functional art. The other day I was chatting with a friend when I suddenly remembered my sculpture teacher burning my lamp designs and saying,
It's either art or design, not both.
I'll call you back. Well, that was 6 years ago, and I thought, I've made the sculpture, but it just sits in the garden waiting to be used. And since I have that chair which doesn't have a light, I reckon now's the time to make that lamp. The question is, what kind of lamp does it want to be? Let's start at the beginning, with this round plywood base I cut as a prototype years ago. This will change, but it'll do for now. The original design had a shade from timber veneer, a familiar shape of your standard lamp to let you know, hey, I'm a lamp, but also a sculpture. Looking at it now, I'm not so sure. So what you're seeing here is me starting from scratch and testing every idea that comes to mind. After all, no idea is a bad idea until you try it, right? The sculpture is 22mm thick solid steel, which I bent using an oxy torch. Now I don't have one of those anymore, but this is kind of what happened. Because it's solid, the cable has to run up the outside in some way. I also needed to figure out how to hold the bulb, keeping in mind that whatever I connected to the sculpture had to be balanced with those twists and turns. I started going a bit rogue with the table leg and log, but then a voice spoke to me.
Mr. Barozzi, remember, less is more.
So with that revelation, some more head tilting and a little sketching, I settled on this. A line of cable running up to contrast the turns, meeting another line of timber to connect the two and ending with a naked bulb. The steel weighs around 10 kilos and is top heavy, so I'm going to make a concrete base, which means I can make it out of any size or shape I want, and the easiest way to test that is with cardboard. I started with a large model and kept cutting it until it looked right. Just when I thought I had it, I couldn't help myself and tested some with an angled face and another with a curved corner. But you know, less is more, so let's move on. Started figuring out how to get the cable to run dead straight and parallel with the base of the stem. I'm using a length of copper pipe, which is the straightest thing in my shed, and trying to eye it off, but it's not exactly accurate. Then it dawned on me. So I wrote myself a 4-step guide to building this lamp. Step 1, make a formwork mould for the concrete base. Step 2, make the arm and cut the holes. Step 3, crack out the old plumb bob. Step 4, drill your holes and mix some concrete. The easiest way to make a mould is with form ply, which has a non-stick laminate face. The plan is to form the holes for the stem and cables into the mould so I don't have to drill the concrete base. Happy that all the pieces came together as they should. I superglued the top and bottom of the box together so that I could drill a hole through both and know it was perfectly aligned. It's always a good idea to pre-drill your holes when screwing into the end grain of plywood, so the screw doesn't push the layers out, which might crack or warp the laminate, which would then of course show up on your concrete when it's dried, and defeat the whole purpose of using laminate in the first place. Now I don't know about you, but building boxes is always satisfying, and taking the time to do it right is validated by a quick check square. If you're not familiar, a plumb bob is a pretty old tool, used as far back as the ancient Egyptians, or further, depending on what you believe about human history. It works by using a string line centered on a heavy weight, giving a vertical direction pointing to gravity. In other words, a straight line, which is a hard thing to measure relative to a bent stem on a wonky floor. Once I figured out where I wanted the cable, I was able to make a mock-up of the final arm with the light fitting, and then bob that again to get the final hole into the formwork. I'm going to run the cable inside the concrete and out the back. But when I was drilling it, I buggered the hole up and tore out the inside face. I mean, what are the chances of hitting that hole that close? The chip out will show on the concrete, so I patched it up and moved on. I searched everywhere for a tube that had the exact diameter of the steel and eventually found that my garden rake was the Cinderella I was looking for. I drilled an access hole in the bottom to pour the concrete through. Pouring from the bottom means the top of the base will have a perfectly flat finish. To make sure I can snake the cable through, I'll be casting a copper elbow, held in the right spot with some wooden dowels. Once the concrete is set, I'll remove the dowels, or at least in theory. Now, most people would wait a week for the concrete to fully cure, but I'm not most people, so let's get into it. It started off well, but good things don't last, and the smaller dowel for the cable absorbed way too much moisture. Got stuck and then snapped off. The only solution was to drill it out. And the same thing happened with the broom handle. But then the camera died, so here's a little reenactment of what happened next. If you got the reference, hit subscribe. So as you can see, it was a little bit tricky, but the holes are clear and everything came together. But it's not perfect, so let's do all of that again, but with a few tweaks. First, I'm going to cut a bigger hole to pour the concrete through. Next, a T-junction instead of an elbow, so I could bash the dowel from both sides. That cooking oil, which has worked for me in the past, is getting switched out with silicone spray. And finally, a different concrete mix, this time an equal ratio of cement and quickset mortar. I'll let that sit a few extra days, and while I wait, I'll start making the final arm, and maybe go out and buy another rake. I needed a way to lock the timber in place on the stem and found these rubber grommets at the hardware store. After a frenzied prototyping session, I came up with this, a hole within a hole, to seat the grommet. Not exactly rocket science, but when you don't have a drill press, you have to figure out the right order of operations, so you don't piss in the wind twice. I wasn't certain on the size, so I ended up making two just in case. You know, a bit of flexibility to change things up, as I feel later on. Now to see if I've actually learnt anything. The silicone definitely helped, and the broom handle came out no problems. The smaller dowel had the same issues though, and needed to be drilled out again, which almost destroyed my drill. It was looking promising, but the second concrete mix was wrong. It hadn't cured properly and fractured off the block like filo pastry. But you know what they say, third time lucky. Or is it all bad things come in threes? It's starting to feel a little bit like Groundhog Day, except on this day I'm switching out the wooden dowel for an aluminium tube. Not to be confused with aluminum, because that's not a word. I also added this little block, but I'll show you why later. Alright, I'm confident this is the final attempt, so I move back to the sculpture, which has a bit of rust from its time in the garden. I could grind it smooth, but I like the texture it has, so I wrapped it up in vinegar towels, which should remove the rust overnight. After a good night's soak, I gave it a rub with steel wool, and then cleaned it off with acetone. I then sealed it with universal wood oil, because someone once told me that works, so it's worth a go. To stop the sculpture from twisting out of alignment with the cable, I'm drilling a hole in the bottom and then tapping it with an M6 thread. I'll then pop in a little grub screw. This will then sit in a wooden block, which is recessed into the bottom of the concrete base, and stop that twisting. It's been a week, and the third time was a charm. The base is as good as I'll get it, and as you can see, I'm pretty excited. Moving on, I gave the two arms the full sanding rundown, and then 2 coats of that universal wood oil. Now it was time just to put it all together. I guess this was really just a story about not letting an idea die, and challenging the reasons why others think it should. In my opinion, there's no right or wrong. Just do whatever interests you, because you will always learn something in the process. Forget the noise and just keep making. It seems to me this lamp is almost like a memory, half representing a time during COVID when the world was crooked and bent, and the other half being now, where I've learnt enough to run a straight path towards whatever idea I want. But what do you think? Is this art or design? Or both?